Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Sid Sudiacal. Dr. Sid Sudiacal received his PhD in theology from McMaster Divinity College. His dissertation is titled "Disgust and the Donatist Controversy," examining the role of disgust in Augustine's letters. His research interests include religious violence, heresies, Beyonce, and the intersection between history, theology, and psychology. So, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Dr. Sid Sudiacal.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So, I would like to ask, how does history, theology, and psychology intersect?
That's a great question. I think a lot of the times, primarily when we are talking about theology, a lot of the times that's when the role of history comes in because we want the historical context of how these theological events have happened. And that is all well and good. But I think sometimes we forget that theologians are also humans. And I think that's where the psychology aspect comes in. And I think gives us a more robust understanding of these historical figures, of these theological figures and events. And I think that's where the intersection of history, theology, and psychology can come together and give us a better look at how these things work out in the day-to-day life.
Can you tell us more specifically about that specific intersection? And did previous individuals or church fathers or anyone else in the past have they noticed any of this as well?
So, in terms of the psychology aspect, yes and no, because I think a lot of the times, whenever uh, Christianity in the past has talked about anything that we might consider psychology, it would be under sort of emotions and learning, or passions or affects. And so, I think in terms of church fathers primarily using psychology, I don't necessarily think so. Not in the current way that we think, or not in the current way that we use psychology, but definitely church fathers have understood the role of emotions in the way that how they can be used to encourage us to live a path that is righteous, or sometimes how to live a path that is unrighteous because of sort of emotions and taking control of these emotions.
And when did this understanding of psychology come to be? How recent is this?
I am not quite sure in terms of the timing, but there have been people who have sort of used different psychological models. I think definitely people who have been using sort of social scientific theories to a certain degree have been using sort of the social science field in terms of helping understand these things better. I think especially there are I know a lot of Hebrew Bible scholars who primarily deal with trauma informed sort of exegesis, um, or other things like that, where technically would not necessarily be under psychology, but I would definitely would say is within the purview of this understanding that there are other fields that we can use to help interact with theology to give us a better understanding of these texts and these figures.
And how does Augustine help us understand any of this? Does he have a perspective on the matter that helps us understand the intersection, or at least how people understood the intersection in his time?
That's a really good question. I think for me, when I was primarily in terms of my own dissertation, I was primarily looking at the way that Augustine used disgust um, to sort of have a conversation with the Donatists and looking at the role of disgust in even his own theological formation. One of the difficulties with disgust and Augustine is that initially he was against the use of violence towards sort of like people who were deemed as heretics, but later on changed with the Donatists and suddenly his agreeance with using state violence to help bring sort of like the heretics back into the Catholic fold. And so primarily what I was looking at was how can disgust be used to in some ways even legitimize state violence, especially in the state in the case of Augustine.
So I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience real quick. Thomas Rhodes, thank you for your question. Wasn't psychology a subset of philosophy until the mid-19th century?
I mean, everything was a subset of philosophy, really, like if you think about it. Yeah, so I would definitely say so. I mean, math is under philosophy, really. So, I mean, philosophy is a huge, huge umbrella that a lot of these things were under, and it's only later that you do get a lot more of like the real specializations of what we now see as psychology.
Mnemo History says, so a psychological determinist view of doctrinal motivation?
No, um, I don't necessarily have a psychological determinist view of doctrinal motivation. I think my question would be maybe a follow up is like, how are you defining the term psychological determinist? Because I think that would maybe help me understand the question a little bit more.
Yeah, he doesn't expand on that, but
Oh,
his
okay.
next
Well, then,
his
yeah,
next
no, absolutely not. Oh.
this is his next question, deconstructing the correspondence view of the truth claims of theologians.
I don't necessarily think that uh, the intersection of history, theology, and psychology really needs to sort of deconstruct the correspondence view of any truth claims. But I think it can definitely lead to deconstructing not just of the correspondence view, but like any view that we can sort of see in theology. I also just don't think that deconstructing is a bad word per se. And so maybe I'm a little bit sort of just I just want to be careful in terms of how I respond to that because I know that deconstructing has become like a very sort of polarizing word, and I'm not quite sure what the author meant or means by the deconstructing. So I just wanted to hedge that response with that.
So when someone hears this for the first time, I'm trying to put myself in that person's shoes just for a moment, because you just mentioned how this could get polarizing when one uses the word deconstruct. Um, how does one, how, what would you say to that individual that's having a hard time understanding this to distinguish what you're talking about, the intersection between history, theology, and psychology, from other attempts to deconstruct uh, these type of things?
I think part of it is sort of um, maybe trying to remove the pejorative ways, I think, in how we have often used the term deconstruction. Because I would say that even within sort of the Christian tradition, we do have another word that basically is synonymous with deconstruction, and I would say that's sanctification, right? The idea that we need to that we're not perfect and that we're in the process of trying to live a life that is worthy of the calling that Christ has given us, especially if you're in the Christian tradition. And so I think that deconstruction becomes a way of sort of seeing, like, in the same way that the psalmist says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew the right spirit within me," then deconstructing becomes a process where you are invited into looking at your own theology and seeing and reflecting on it and sort of making sure that it is in line with sort of what you may view as sort of like, God's truth, or um, a sort of like, I guess, like, yeah, like how do you live a life that is properly meant to live for God? And obviously that is within sort of like the Christian tradition.
Thomas Rhodes again. My philosophy professor in college was blown away when I suggested that we could draw a straight line between Plato and Augustine.
Oh, I could see that. Um, there's a lot of books on Plato and Augustine. So I'm pretty sure someone could sort of draw like a straight line between Plato and Augustine, especially um, with sort of uh, Augustine's own sort of grounding in philosophy, in Greek philosophy.
Can you tell us a little bit about Tertullian and Cyprian, their theological legacy in the North African Church, and how it is involved in the difficulty of understanding the Donatist controversy?
Well, that's a good question. One of the thing with Tertullian and Cyprian is that they are huge North African theological figures. Tertullian was someone who truly saw sort of, like you often hear the saying that, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and that's been sort of some scholars would attribute it to Tertullian, some not. So there's, yeah. So I think the similarity with them is that they were both very um, huge figures and influences in the the North African church, and how the North African church ended up sort of uh, coming together and living out their lives. Both of them have very strong sort of like ideas when it comes to sort of issues of how to be a good Christian, right? And how should I live a Christian life? And I think with with Cyprian, definitely, uh, especially within the context of the Donatist controversy, a lot of both the Catholics and the Donatists really try to go back to Cyprian and find their theological lineage with Cyprian. And so I think in that case, he was such a huge figure in terms of being an example of how to do church, how to live life, how to be a good priest to a certain degree, how to be a good Christian. And so that's how I think those two figures factor in terms of like just like the great legacy, great theological legacy that was left in North Africa.
Nemo, history says, what is left when we remove through this sanctification process of psychological motivations that do not correspond to the standard of doctrine?
I'm not quite sure in terms of what it means, that what you need to ask, and so I'm just going to respond with what I think. Uh, I think that one of the most important parts, I think, of trying to understand the history of sort of psychology, theology, and history is that uh, it is a way to help understand theological figures, theological events, but it is not the way that corresponds to any standard of doctrine, because it doesn't necessarily address that. it can maybe help you understand how the doctrine was formed, in terms of like, hey, these are some elements that could be at play when this person came up with this particular idea or this particular understanding of who God is, or how God works in the world. But it has nothing to do in terms of validating or not validating doctrines.
So, how long was the issue with the Donatists continued? Because throughout your dissertation, you mentioned that the issue with the Donatists has been a problem for in the ancient church for a very long time. Could you
Yeah.
discuss that?
Uh, to a certain degree, it hasn't stopped. um, there was
Right.
actually an article. I my goodness, I forgot the author. But what they were talking about was how in so many ways, the term Donatist has taken on a life of its own, and so while the Donatist movement may have ended, with in late antiquity, that term is still being used right now as basically as something that is synonymous with heretics. And so, in that sense, it hasn't really left us. It's still alive and well, and you actually like you often hear it a lot if you're in some circles of like if you're acting in a heretical way to sort of like you're a Donatist. So that's still sort of I think still at play. Like I don't think it has gone, and I think that's why I think it's important to sort of like learn and understand that some of the things that we now are experiencing, like there's a reason for that.
What was Cyprian's attitude towards the Donatists, and was it different or identical to Augustine's attitude towards them as well?
So Cyprian's relationship with the Donatists, where like he was already dead by the time that the Donatists were at play. Um, but a lot of the ways that he sort of his thoughts on certain things became very much some things that were related to uh, how the Donatists viewed a lot of things. So I think one of the biggest differences with Cyprian and Augustine when it came to sort of the issues that were present with Donatism was the issue of baptism. Um, and Cyprian, to a certain degree, was okay with rebaptism, and Augustine was not. And so that became a huge sort of problem between the two in terms of how do you understand the workings of what happens during baptism, and how what is the role of the priest that is conducting the baptism, like how are those things at play when a sacrament like that is being offered. So I think that's where the differences would be, whereas where Cyprian would be okay with rebaptism and Augustine is definitely not okay with rebaptism.
Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of the Donatist movement?
So back in the day, so a lot of it happened sort of in the wake of the the persecution by Diocletian. And so 303 to 305 CE was when there were a lot of sort of persecutions that were taking place. Um, but if you sort of read Canute Moss's uh, book on the myth of persecution, there's sort of a debate of whether this is persecution per se or prosecution. So go read that in terms of how that plays out. But basically, what happened is that 311, the there was basically a stop due to the edict. I think it's the Edict of Milan, if I'm not mistaken. And then what happens with the people who were forced to recant or sort of give up sacred texts the during the time of persecution? Are they allowed to come back into the church or not? And so that became a huge issue within sort of the church, and how do we deal with uh, the lapsed people who did all of that? And so one group said no, they can't come back in. Another group said yes, they can come back in. And the people who said that they can't come back in later became the Donatist movement.
Can you tell us a little bit about how Carthage, or the discussion of Carthage, and also the Free Punic Wars, how was that involved in the discussion about what Cyprian says in his letters, and how does it help us understand this specific situation?
I am not quite sure how to answer that. I think that definitely when it comes to uh, Carthage, because of like the Punic Wars, there's been such a huge sort of, like you don't necessarily have a great relationship with Rome at that point. And so I think that um, probably, like, I'm not quite sure in terms of like what you're referring to within the letters, but I think definitely their relationship with Rome would definitely have an effect, because by the time that especially during the Donatist controversy, uh, Augustine Augustine's relationship with Rome was definitely seen as suspect, because I think there's been such a huge sort of like issue with Rome, I think, especially within the North African context.
Well, the reason why I was asking that question because in page 68,
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me get
yeah,
my.
Carthage, a city of resilience.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Page 68.
Yeah, because just after you start talking about Carthage, you mentioned Cyprian and the Punic Wars and uh, Cyprian's letters and his remarks.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, that's why I was asking about that.
Oh, I think it's because of the the similarity with the idea with sort of with the Novatians speaking out against Cyprian, because he ended up fleeing, and so they definitely looked down on Cyprian for doing that, and I think also within sort of that issue, like the the question of whether to leave or whether to stay was always a huge issue, I think, within the Christian church, and there were always people who have been on either side of the debate. And I think what happened with sort of Cyprian and him leaving played a huge role in, I think, how sometimes he was spoken against by certain groups of definitely like from Rome's like more rigorous position.
So now my next question will be based on page 71. What do you mean when you say Cyprian to rebaptize or not to rebaptize? That is the question. So how is that a question, and what's the significance of that?
So one of the I think I would say the modern equivalent of to rebaptize or not to rebaptize happens sometimes here when if you enter into some particular evangelical or Protestant denominations and you've been baptized at a different church before going to their church, to be a member of that particular church, sometimes they ask you to be baptized in that particular church. And so that is very similar to sort of the ongoing question that was happening in Cyprian's time of whether uh, we should rebaptize people who come from churches that we may deem as heretical. And so if you want to fellowship with us, uh, should you be baptized again? And so that was basically the question that is meant by the question of Cyprian to to rebaptize or not, because how do you end up belonging to this particular local community of believers? Um, and baptism is a huge identity marker in that sense. And so, uh, are you supposed to rebaptize, or are you just allowed to let them in, even though they were baptized from another group that you don't necessarily agree with to a certain degree? So that was sort of the question that um, is addressing.
So, what are your thoughts on Peter John Kramer's argument that in the progression to belief through revelation, which is implied in the Apostles' Creed, the identity of the Christian is still an identity through transition?
What page is that? Sorry.
That's page 72.
Oh, okay. Um, it could go either way. Because I think sometimes a question of identity is really hard to deal with. I think especially the idea of Christian identity, because part of Christian orthodoxy maintains that it's static, right? In the sense of like once you've been made a Christian, you're forever Christian. Some sort of denominations would put this under the very common like once saved, always saved sort of mentality. But the idea that we are in transition is also at play in Christian orthodoxy, because the idea of sanctification is that we are constantly being remade in the image of God uh, if we walk with Him. And so I think the idea that the identity of the Christian is still an identity through transition, I think, is something that is captured by that process of theosis, of being made more like God.
My next question is about page 73. So just a couple of pages after what I just discussed. You mentioned that Burns distinguishes the difference in how baptism was used by Cyprian and Augustine. Uh, his thesis statement is to attempt to demonstrate why Augustine emphasized the ritual's effect as forgiving sins. In the process, however, Augustine seems to have broken the link between the effect and the symbolism of the ritual. So, do you think that Augustine and Cyprian really had a different view in baptism, as Burns seems to think, or do you have different thoughts on the matter?
I think he does. I think there was a very different understanding of baptism, I think, by Cyprian and Augustine. Um, and I think that that difference is primarily what led to sort of the ongoing debate between the two in terms of like the thinking around it. Um, and I think Augustine does something that is very um, unique, I think, in the process of reconceptualizing baptism, that I think was very innovative.
So I'd like to take a look into Constantine's time real quick. So how did Emperor Constantine view the Donatists?
Well, they were seen as heretics, and there was a council in Arles in 314 that said so. There was another sort of recommitment to the idea that they are heretics. So they were not seen uh, very well by Constantine.
And what happened to them after they did not acquiesce to Constantine's demands?
Well, a huge part was the confiscation of properties. Was a huge kind of way in which the Donatists were punished for, you know, having being a Donatist, but that also led to a lot of the tension and the violence between the two groups because once you're once you start confiscating land is a huge issue then and now. And so you can imagine if the state suddenly starts taking your land back, how a lot of people would sort of rebel against that. So I think that definitely helped in sort of fostering and perpetuating the violence between the two groups.
I'd like to go back to the audience for a moment. And feel free to tell me if you think the question is off topic. I'll just take it off the screen.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Uh, Mnemo History says, when contextualizing a theologian's ideas by situating their psychological motivations within historical pressures, is an internal choice to live up to a particular set of virtues meaningful?
Hmm. Okay, so I just wanted to preface this by saying that in terms of what I was primarily looking at within the Donatist controversy, I was primarily looking at the role of disgust, which is an emotion. And so I was primarily using disgust psychology to look at sort of the actions. Um, I think it is very difficult, obviously, to situate someone's psychological motivations within historical pressures. Um, and I think this is where the historical context and the theological context can come and sort of help bring out sort of like a better understanding of what the psychological motivations would be, because I think it gives a more fuller understanding of what are some of the pressures that these figures were experiencing. And definitely, I think the choice to live up to a particular set of virtues is very important. I think we find that especially within a lot of Christian literature and a lot of Christian figures, definitely those set of virtues and how they end up uh, working out those virtues, especially when it comes to issues of righteousness, becomes really, really um, fascinating to a certain point because what counts as a righteous act by one particular group of people might be seen as unrighteous act by another group of people, but they're both using the same language. And so I think living up to a particular set of virtues is definitely meaningful, but that also means that uh, the way that you exhibit that particular set of virtues is also meaningful. Um, but that also creates a lot of issues in terms of when is it actually righteous and when is it actually not, because there has been a very strong um, tradition, I think, especially within Christianity, to use the name of God in the provocation and incitement of wars or hatred towards another group. And so that's, I think, where uh, the psychological motivations can be helpful to look at to see why someone is acting in the way that they are acting, even though two people might be reading the same text, but somehow they're coming at it from two very different viewpoints.
Can you tell us what makes violence so complex? Because this is in page 198. You're saying here, what makes violence so complex is that it resists static definition. And you mentioned that Magnana
Mm-hmm.
rightly argues that violence is always perceived as such directly by an individual who eventually derives a way of perceiving from the shared culture of the groups to which he belongs.
Mm-hmm. Um, the violence is complicated because it something that looks nice can actually not be nice. Um, I think a lot of the times, like I would say, for example, like the concept of like racism, right? I think I would like to think that there is a general consensus that lynching is bad, right? So I think when people think of racism, they primarily think of lynchings, um, which is a violent act. Uh, but I think sometimes people don't necessarily realize that microaggressions can also act in sort of like these same violent ways, right? And so when someone, like if you're at a store and you're shopping and then someone comes up to you and asks, okay, like, oh, like, where is this? And they assume that you're staff just because you're not white. uh, I mean, obviously, it does not rise to the level of violence that sort of like a lynching would do, but like it is still something that has a profoundly negative impact on the person who is experiencing that microaggression, um, to because they are yet again made to feel that they are not the norm, right? And so things like that. So I think that's where the the difficulty with violence and that it resists static definition is that a smile can be seen as threatening if under certain conditions. Um, so how are you going to say never smile? Right. So things like that. So I think that's where it does resist static definitions because it it's very complex in terms of how it's played out.
And so, my closing question, how would you sum up your general argument for the intersection of history, theology, and psychology? And after you do that, can you tell the audience where they may find your dissertation so they can read it?
Yes. I would say that the intersection, studying the intersection of history, theology, and psychology can really give a more robust look at theological events and figures. I think it complicates things. Uh, and I know that sometimes we don't like complications, but life is messy, life is complicated. And I think the more that we realize that these are people just like us trying to understand things the way that they are with the resources that they have, and that makes them just like us. And I think the problem sometimes when we look at theological figures is that we tend to romanticize them, and they're not. They're messy. They're complicated. Uh, and I think using sort of uh, psychology to help understand these theological and historical events, I think in so many ways it can actually create a better relationship with how we look at someone. I think it's the same way that, when you're a child, you see your parents as, superheroes, and then you're adolescent and they're like the dumbest people who ever saw and walked the face of the earth. And then when you become an adult and you're just like, okay, like they're not as bad as I thought they were. Right. And I think part of that is sort of just like the wisdom through age. Right. And I think this is also what psychology can sort of help illuminate in those spaces, is that, like, what are they going through? How are they very much like we are? And they're also going through the same difficulties that we're living through, the same, they have the same hopes and dreams as us. And I think because of that, it creates, maybe creates more of an affinity to these people that maybe can feel too luminary of a figure from afar, right? Like, especially with Augustine, right? Like, I mean, you don't really get any bigger, I think, especially within sort of like Christian history, than Augustine. But to be able to actually see him as a person with his own hangups, with his own flaws, with his own triumphs, with his own defeats, I think really creates a better space for us to understand what they're going through. And I think in some ways it actually helps us become less judgmental on how we see these people. As much as I have had my issues with Augustine, I've also had moments where I don't know if I would have done any differently under those circumstances, right? And so I think creating this space where we can truly understand others as they need to be understood becomes a really great way, I think, to look at the past and hopefully be able to use that same mentality as we look into the present and see the historical and theological events that are happening, and wondering, how can they do that? Why would they say that? And then realizing that to a certain degree, nothing has changed. People have been people for a very long time, and they will continue to be people. Conflicts will always happen. Wars will always be here. But at the same time, like, how can we learn from the past so that we don't do the same mistakes? And I think that's where understanding sort of that intersection can be so helpful in helping us be just better people who can analyze the events that are happening right before our eyes. Oh, and if you would like to read my dissertation, it is, if you just type the title, and maybe you can do that, but it will show up on Google. Just basically write my dissertation in, and it will be right there. And just make sure to write master or something like that, because it'll definitely show up, because I Googled it too.
I'll add the link to the description when I close the live
thank
stream
you.
as well. So it's easy to make it easier for the audience to get there.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Sid Sudiacal.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.